Good evening. We're thankful to have everybody here that is with us. Thankful for those who get to come and visit with us from time to time. Glad to see you. We're going to be continuing a thought from this morning. This morning we asked the question of what is a home? And we asked that question so that we could help ourselves to better assess the situation of eternity. The Bible would explain to us that there's two possibilities as to where we could spend all of eternity. And that's in heaven with God the Father, and opposed to that is hell. And this morning we talked about heaven. And in talking about heaven, we wanted to understand the beauty of heaven, and we can do that by looking at who is in heaven. Who does heaven belong to? And whenever we did that, we looked at how John, as well as the angels, would describe God in his presence there. And the overwhelming point of John and the angels and the voice of those who are of the redeemed is that God is the most beautiful being. And it doesn't have to do with any type of physical characteristic, but it has to do with his deeds and his ways, what he has done and who he is, how he is. We also saw that Christ has his habitation in heaven. And whenever we considered Christ and his habitation, we looked at how John would describe him, and we would look at how the angels describe him and how the redeemed describe him. And the overwhelming point there is that Christ is the most powerful being. And so heaven is the home of the most beautiful being, God the Father. It is the home of the most powerful being, Jesus Christ, the victorious, the one who was dead and is alive forevermore and holds the keys of death and Hades in his hand. And it is also the home through what the angels have said, and through what the redeemed have said, and through what Christ himself had said concerning the salvation of the Christian, as well as concerning the deeds of the Christian. The voice from heaven was talking about in Revelation 14 and verse 13 the blessing that it is to die in the Lord. And the Spirit would add to that, blessed indeed, says the Spirit, for they shall receive rest from their labors, for their deeds do follow them. And that is a key phrase right there. Their deeds do follow them. Heaven is a reward. And as we saw this morning, as we were talking just briefly about some of the physical descriptors that we see in the Bible, what we see concerning hell is quite the contrary. Hell, Jesus explained to us, is a fiery furnace in Matthew 13 and verse 50. It is the outer darkness. He would describe to us in Matthew 8 and verse 12, Matthew 22 and verse 13, and Matthew 25 and verse number 30. It is the place of eternal punishment. Jesus would describe for us in Matthew 25 and verse number 46. And it is a decision that we make as to where we will stay. But so that we can understand the picture of hell to an even greater degree, we're continuing here in the book of Revelation, looking around at how we see the inhabitants of hell. Who is hell for? The simple answer is hell is for the devil and his angels, right? That's the simple answer. And so when we look at Revelation and we see these figures depicted, the devil and his angels, what do we see depicted about them? What do we see that helps us to understand what hell is and who it belongs to? If we're in Revelation chapter 12, I find this interesting. You can make it into the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation before you read about the devil. The devil is introduced to us in Revelation chapter 12 as the dragon. And we see in verses 1 through 6 that the dragon has beset himself against the child of the woman. The child representing Christ, the woman representing, I would suggest, religion. Christ is the outpouring of religion. He is the fulfillment of religion. And Satan had opposed the woman, and then he opposes the child. And then in verses 7 through 10, we see Satan engaged in a battle of sorts. It says in verse 7, "Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon." Again, keep in mind, John's writing these things in signs and figures. And so it does not necessitate that there's any literalness to what we're reading, but we need to understand the overall picture, understand the big picture here. It says, "Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ has come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God." Let's look even in verse 11. "And they have conquered him by the blood of..." 7 through 11, we see a description of Satan here. And this is what we see. We look at verse 7. And one of the first things, again, we're being introduced to Satan in the book. One of the first things that God is having us to understand about Satan through the pen of John is that Satan is a loser. Satan is defeated. Satan is defeated in heaven. Satan is defeated on earth. Verse 11, that's the point there. They have conquered him. Who has conquered him? Those upon the earth. The brethren have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives, even unto death. They have fully entrusted themselves to Christ. And so even in spite of Satan having a great deal of power, Satan is severe. Peter would stress that for us in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. To be sober-minded, to be watchful, for your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Time and time again, the New Testament is filled with warnings about either Satan or his influences. But it's also filled with the knowledge that he has, number one, already been defeated in the heavenly realm, and number two, we stand with the possibility, so long as we have entrusted ourselves to Christ, we stand with the certainty at that point of overcoming him on earth. That's what John was writing to the children and the fathers and the young men in 1 John chapter 2 and verses 11 through 14. That they have overcome, and it's all placed upon their trust and obedience to the Lord. The fact that the Word of God abided within them. They were obedient to his commandments. And so we see Satan here depicted as one who is defeated. We see in verse 9 some of his qualities. Verse 9, he's a deceiver. He has deceived the whole world. Jesus makes that clear to us. Jesus describes Satan as the father of lies. The very origination point of any type of departure from truth comes from Satan. Satan is the first to lie. Satan is the first to seek death. Satan is the first to cause and look for separation between man and God. And that's something that John wants us to understand here. And that's important for us because it's a sobering picture of Satan. Satan is alluring, right? Satan has his devices, 1 John 2 and verse 16. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And he tried to tempt Jesus with those things, but we had to have the singular focus like Jesus had, to always do those things which please his Father, Mark 7 and verse 29. And so Jesus, even in spite of the alluring temptations of Satan was able to maintain his righteousness, and we too can as well. But understand, Satan is a liar. He is a loser. He is a liar. And verse 13 and verse 17, we can look at that. Verse 13, it says, and when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, how did he respond? Did he understand he had lost? Did he accept his defeat? Well, no, just like any sore loser, he turns his focus somewhere else. He can't beat God. Maybe he can beat God's people. And so verse 13, and when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. Verse 17, then the dragon became furious with the woman because he wasn't able to defeat the woman. So he became furious with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring. The woman's had other children. Those are those who were born after the likeness of Christ, born unto righteousness. And that's specified on those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. He beset himself against them. And so it's understood Satan is a detester of God and the people of God. He's an enemy. And that's something that's incredibly necessary that we understand. Satan is an enemy of the church, an enemy of the Christian. And it's important for us to understand because John's writing to religious people. I'm right now speaking to religious people. Do we want a home, an eternal home, with someone who the whole entirety of our lives, his desire has been to drag us down and deprive us of all that is good? Is that the type of home that we want? I don't think it is. Would you rather have your home with a winner or with a loser? Look in Revelation 20 and verses 9 and 10, and you see what hell is. Hell is the home of losers. In Revelation 20 and verses 9 and 10, it says, and they marched up. This is Satan. He has been released out of prison. Basically, he's been allowed to go and to continue with his influences, right? And it's coming close to the point in the of judgment, and we'll see that in verse 11 where that begins. But in verse 9 it says, and they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, but fire came down from heaven and consumed them. Verse 10, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they were and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Revelation 20 verses 9 and 10 makes it very clear. Hell is the place for losers. It is the place for those who have beset themselves against God, those who have beset themselves against the people of God, enemies of righteousness, enemies of blessing, enemies of good, and they are thrown into the lake of fire. So as we look at Satan, just looking at Satan himself, and understand that verses 9 and 10 include the beast and the false prophet, so those are his satanic forces, those who are of his aid, the devil and his angels, right? When we look at Satan, here's three things that typify him for us. You have death. Satan is typified by death. He is the one who had the power of death. He is one who influences death upon the earth. He is a deceiver. And so number 2 is deceit. But number 3 is defeat. He's destructive and he's alluring, but he loses. He is not victorious. Let's turn our attention to, as Revelation 20 and verse 10 help to indicate for us, the beast and those who are of the aid of Satan. We see this in Revelation 13. In Revelation 13, you see 2 different beasts emerging, kind of picturing for us 2 things. So we consider the first beast. We could just look at this real briefly. Let's look at verses 1 through 3. He says, "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet like a bear's, its mouth like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and his great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast." 1 through 3, just understand this, is a picture of the relentlessness of Satan. The relentlessness of Satan. And you can see that even further if you look in verse 11. "Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon." The second beast emerging. Why? Because Satan is not done trying to influence us. And you can see that as we continue into chapter 17 with the harlot, Babylon. A depiction of how Satan can use the nations even to fulfill his plan of attacking the church, God, and his people. If we look at the two beasts, I want us to see these things about the two beasts real quick. Looking at the first beast, if we look in verse 6 and 7, we get some understanding of who the beast is and what it is that he is desired to do. It says in verse 6, "It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given over it over every tribe and the people and language and nation." And so 6 and 7 help us to understand that the beast is not the friend of the Christian. The beast blasphemes God and his dwelling. His dwelling is his people. Revelation 21 and verse number 3, the dwelling place of God is with his people. And so the beast is the enemy of the saint. And that's really brought out in verse 7 in the phrase there, makes war against the saints. We look at the second beast and we see that much of that same pattern continues. The blasphemies continue, again speaking like a dragon, you saw in verse 11, but the persecution continues. So look there in verse 15, it says, "And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain." Who would not worship the image of the beast? Well, the righteous. The righteous would say, "God alone shall you worship." Just like Jesus had said in his temptations. And so, the beast slays those who do not worship its image. And it causes all, both great and small, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand and the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the mark of the beast, or the number of its name. So just understand 16 and 17. The point there is, so the persecution is very much physical. We go and slay the beast. But the persecution is also social. We reject those who do not worship the beast. We will kill them. We will reject them. There is no toleration for those who would not worship the beast. Again, the major point here is that the beast, which typifies the angels of Satan, those who are of his cause, those who are of his assistance in carrying out his desires and plan, they are entirely against the Christian. All the while, they are the ones that help to dangle the alluring little lures before our eyes of those lures of Satan. If you look in chapter 17, we have the introduction of the great harlot. That is, in the context, I believe, referring to Rome, but ultimately referring to any type of nation that does not exalt righteousness. And so, when we look at this nation in verses 17 and 18, what we see concerning the nation in verse number 6, this is an unrighteous nation. And so looking at it, this is what John says. John said, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. That's not friendly to the Christian. Not the friend of the Christian, but the foe. There's nothing good there. Nothing to be cherished, nothing to be desired, nothing to be overlooked. We see in verse 7, or rather in verse 8, a description of this same woman. In verse 8, chapter 17, it says, the beast that you saw, referring to that, is not. What does that mean? The beast that you saw is not. John had seen these two beasts, and he had seen the two beasts yoke itself to the woman. And what he hears now is that it is not. And it is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. It's defeated. And the dwellers on earth whose name have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. And so those who had worshipped the beast are going to be dismayed. Because here it is, they have considered the beast and the dragon which presides over the beast and the harlot which serves alongside the beast. They have considered this to be the real power. They considered this to be the real authority. They considered this to be worthy of worship, and they will be dismayed because the object of their worship will be defeated. That's who heaven is, or that's who hell is for. The failure, the loser, the enemy of the Christian. We see concerning the woman in chapter 17 and verse number 14, it says, they will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. They're not going to win. And so he's able to say in verse 8, the beast that you see is no more. But then in verse 14, it's going to make war. And so before he can even set its feet to make war with the Lamb, it is destined for destruction. It is doomed. It is the only possible outcome of that conflict of Satan and God, is that God will reign victorious every single time. And so who do you want your home to be with? The victorious God or the losing devil? We see concerning the devil, his forces here, that they are going to be entirely decimated. They're going to be decimated by plague, chapter 18 and verse number 4. They're going to be decimated by fire, chapter 18 and verse number 8. They're going to be laid to waste, chapter 18, verse 17, as well as verse 19. They're going to be thrown down in violence, and they will be no more. Chapter 18 and verse 21. Again, emphasizing for us the great picture that they are going to be utterly destroyed. And you know what is found whenever they're destroyed? What is found whenever they look into the loser and they dissect the loser, they see the slain beast and they open it up to see what was inside. What has it been attacking? What has it been trying to do? What is it feasting upon? Verse 24, and in her was the blood of the prophets and of the saints, and all those who have been slain on earth. Satan's an undiscriminatory opponent of all mankind. Does he hate the righteous? Absolutely he hates the righteous. He also hates the wicked. It's not who you want to spend your eternity with. Continue looking at Satan and his forces. When we continue looking, all we see is loss and failure, and we understand that's what hell is, a place prepared for the failure. But it's not just Satan. It's not just his forces that are going to be there. is going to be those who follow Satan as well. And God will describe those people for us in Revelation chapter 21 and verse number 8. He would say, "But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for the murderer, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars." If you just look at those, that's a very broad spectrum, right? In our minds, we might draw a big line of contrast between the coward and the murderer, right? Between the liar and the sexually immoral. But the cowardly, in what sense are they cowards? They have turned away from their Lord because of earthly persecutions. In what way are they detestable? In the same sense that they're faithless. They have rejected the gospel and its goodness in order to save their own lives. And Jesus told us in Luke chapter 14, whoever wishes to save his own life will lose it. And that's what we see here in verse 8. That those who had at one point entrusted their soul to Christ and have turned their back on him are just as guilty of sin and due of punishment as those who have lived in open-handed rebellion. You don't get slack because you once put your hand to the plow. Jesus said in Luke 9 and verse 62, "Whoever puts his hand to the plow and looks back is not fit for the kingdom of God." Hebrews 10 and verse 38, the Lord said, "My soul takes no pleasure in those who shrink back." And so the Hebrew writer would say in verse 39, we are not those who shrink back. May we not be named with these. Why? Their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. I read about the lake of fire and sulfur in verse 10 of chapter 20 as being the place to which Satan is thrown, the place which the beast is thrown, the false prophet is thrown. God depicts it for us here. And this is what God's getting us to understand. Revelation 14 verse 13 was key. "Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, for they shall receive rest from their labors, for were their gar in the Greek means because their labors do follow them." What they have done provides what they will receive. It leads to what they will receive. So Revelation 21 and verse 8, why are they thrown in the lake of fire and sulfur? Because their deeds do follow them. They receive right payment for what they have done. And Paul would draw our attention to that in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10. Paul would cause us to look soberly inwardly, because we would understand that we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, and we will all be paid according to the deeds done in the body, whether good or evil. God explains who those are who are going to hell, those who follow Satan. John would describe them in Revelation 20 verses 11 through 15. John would say, "Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what is written in the books, according to what they have done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done." Twice emphasized for us, verse to verse, what they had done. Verse 14, then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. The book of life. We can look at Malachi 3 in verse, I believe, 16. Malachi 3. You have mentioning of what's called a book of remembrance, which corresponds to a book which keeps up with our deeds. And it's God's account of what we have done. And it's what he will open up, and it is what he will pay us according to. Those who remember him, he will remember and reward. Those who forget him, he will remember and punish. We look at how John describes them. These are people who their name is not found in the Lamb's Book of Life. They have not lived after him. They have not lived in service to him. So who goes to hell? Those who go to hell are those who have turned away from him. There are those who live in open-handed rebellion against God. They are those who have not lived in step with the gospel, as Paul would describe it, lived in a manner worthy of the calling to which we've been called, as he would describe also in Ephesians chapter 4, not lived according to the commandments of Christ, not walked how he walked, John would describe, 1 John 2 in verse 6. But how, or who else is going there? Is there more? We go back to Revelation chapters 2 and 3. We looked at that this morning when we talked about how Christ sees the Christian, how Christ sees those who have conquered and what type of reward they will receive. Well, what does Christ say about those, if we understand it correctly and read it properly? What does Christ say about those who are going to hell? Again, Christ wrote 7 letters, or Christ had sent 7 letters to 7 churches. 5 of these churches had some sort of improvement that they needed to make. If that improvement was not made, they were blotted out of the Lamb's Book of Life. And so, if we don't make these improvements, that means we're blotted out of the Lamb's Book of Life. So what are the improvements? What are the things that can help separate or can cause a separation between religious people and a reward in heaven? Because that's who this is, religious people, chapters 2 and 3. Well, we look at the church in Ephesus, and we see in chapter 2 and verse 4 that they have forsaken, they have abandoned, they have forgotten their first love. There's some debate. Is that a love for Christ? Is that a love for the brethren? Guess what? John helps us to understand that the two are inseparable in 1 John 3 and verse number 10. So we can either abandon the love for Christ, and we can grow cold in our desires to serve him. We might claim him, but we don't serve him, and so we're cast out. Kind of reminds me of what the Lord asked those who were following beside him. Why callest me Lord, Lord, and do not do the things I command you? But also not loving your brethren. Not loving your brethren is set on the same level by both Christ in his earthly ministry and his teachings in Matthew chapter 5 and in John's writing in 1 John 3 as murder. What else separates us? We look at what he wrote to the church in Pergamum in chapter 2 and verses 14 and 15. Practicing false religion. Chapter 2 verse 14, he says, but I have a few things against you. You have some who hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel so that they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. So also you have some who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans. The teaching of Balaam has to do with serving other gods along with or in replacement of the Lord God. We can go back to the example of Balaam, who was assisting Balak in prophesying or attempting to prophesy against the people, and then ultimately told them, this is how you defeat the people of Israel. Give them your women and they'll start worshiping your gods. And that has been a pivotal point, or that was a pivotal point from that point on. And it's something which is referred to so often in the prophets. The day, the events which took place at Baal Peor, where Balaam sold them over to Balak. You have the Nicolaitans. It seems to deal with a doctrine that is closely tied to something of the effect of once saved, always saved. Now that you're in Christ, abound in sin. Paul would tell us otherwise. Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. Romans 6 and verse number 1. Another thing that separates us from him, as we see to the church in Thyatira, is the toleration of sin. In chapter 2, in verse number 20. But I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols. The toleration of wickedness separates us from him. There's a responsibility, right? Paul would remind the church in Corinth of that responsibility. Cleanse the leaven. Cleanse the leaven that's in the lump. 1 Corinthians 5 and verse number 7. There's an obligation to protect the saints. If we don't do that, that can separate us from him eternally. In chapter 3 and verse 1 to the church in Sardis, he would write, I know your works. You have the reputation of being alive, but you are dead. These are people who have the outward appearance of religiousness, but inwardly they are decaying. Inwardly they are dead. Inwardly they are cold. They're inactive. They're inactive. So you can go through the motions, essentially. But going through the motions is only going to get you to hell. Here's another thing. To the church in Laodicea, the Lord would write in verse 15, going through verse 17, or 18 rather. He says, I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot, but that you are either cold or hot. So that because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, I need nothing, not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire, so that you may be rich, and white garments, so that you may clothe yourself, and the shame of your nakedness may not be seen, and salve to anoint your eyes, that you may see. What is the problem there? Self-reliance. Self-reliance. We don't need anything from you. We got it figured out ourselves. And again, this is religious people. Religious people. Now, you look at hell. Who goes to hell? Whose home is in hell? Satan, his demons, and those who follow him. They might not admit that they follow him, right? John chapter 8 is a good example of that. The Pharisees say, we're of our father Abraham. Jesus says, you're not of your father Abraham, you're of your father the devil. You think they acknowledge that? You think they recognize that we follow the devil? No. But by their deeds and their practices, that's who they were. That's who hell is for. Now, what do we do with that information? Here's two things that we see in the book of Revelation. Look with me, just briefly, Revelation chapter 13 and verse 10. We were in chapter 13 earlier when we saw the beast, how it is that the beast has blasphemed God and his dwelling. It says, if anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. That's one of two. There's two calls of endurance to the saints in this book. And so chapter 13 and verse 10, here's what I think the implication is. anyone who practices sin will receive the wages of sin, which is death. That's what the beast was able to accomplish, the killing of the saints, because they had forfeited themselves to him. They were defeated by him. You see that in verse 8. In verse 8. And all who dwell on earth will worship him. Everyone whose name had not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. So the world was taken captive because of the fact that they indulged in the teachings and practices of the beast. They practiced sin, so they received the wages of sin, which is death, Romans 6:23, James 1 verse 15. Here's the second call to endurance in chapter 14, verses 9 through 12. And another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger. And he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the Lamb, or of the holy angels, and in the presence of the Lamb. And the torment of the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, these worshippers of the beast and its image, whoever receives the mark of its name. Verse 12, here is a call of endurance for the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus, those who worship the beast, comprehensive of anything that lacks submission to God. Open-handed rebellion, turning against him, living in a hypocritical way, practicing quasi-Christianity, they will be destroyed along with the beast. It's a call to endurance. It's a sober reminder. You will be rewarded according to what you do. And if you find yourself against God, you will find yourself against him for all eternity. And so you have to make a decision. Will you endure and receive a heavenly home, or will you stray and receive a home in hell? One which, again, is everlasting punishment. It is away from the presence of God, 2 Thessalonians 1 and verse 8 tells us. And it is a home of those, as it is so heavily indicated for us in this book, a home of those who have failed. What will you do? Will you, Christian, endure and set your eyes on Christ and follow him and be like those in Revelation 7 and verse 14, that it is said that they have made their robes white with the blood of the Lamb? Will you do that? Will you follow him wherever he goes? Revelation 14 and verse number 5. Or will you turn against him and make your habitation in hell? Jesus offers a way of salvation for those who are outside of him so that they don't have to go to hell. And that way of salvation includes what he has done. He had come and given his life. Mark 10 and verse 45. And it includes what you will do. And Jesus tells us in John 8 and verse 24 that we must be those who believe in him. We must be those, Luke 13 verse 3, who repent of our sins, who confess him before men, Matthew 10:32, who are baptized, Mark 16 and verse number 16, and those who are faithful, Matthew 10 and verse 22. What will we decide? What will we choose? If there's a way which we can help you tonight, if you need prayers, if you need study, if you need to put your Lord on the baptism, you come and do that now as here we stand as we sing.